This is your host, Danny, and this is a new episode from English Plus Podcast. Welcome to this episode of English Plus Podcast, where we dive deep into the meaning and usage of 10 key words from a fascinating text about Sir Isaac Newton's law of motion. We'll explore words like apocryphal, behemoth, brevity, dally, depreciate, paraphrase, reinforce, relatively, respite, and svelte. And we will learn about their meanings and common usage. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, be sure to follow our podcast on your favorite platform, share it with your friends and family, and leave us a rating and review to let us know what you think. Now let's get started with our story for today about Newton's 3 laws that must be obeyed. Sir Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727, a British physicist and mathematician, possessed one of the keenest scientific intellects of his time. But in spite of his brilliance, he was a humble person who always tried to depreciate his contribution to science, preferring instead to honor the scientists who had preceded him. He once remarked, "If I have seen further than others, it is by standing upon the shoulders of giants." Newton is famous primarily for his laws describing motion. When the plague forced Cambridge University to shut down temporarily, Newton left the university and stayed for a time at his mother's farm. Instead of dallying, however, Newton used this respite from his formal education to study and think. It was during this period that Newton formulated the 3 laws of motion that bear his name. These 3 laws reduce nearly all the motion we observe to concepts that are relatively simple considering the complexities of physics. There is a popular, but no doubt apocryphal, story that Newton discovered gravity when an apple fell on his head as he sat under a tree. While there's no evidence to support this particular story, it seems certain that observing falling objects caused Newton to think about the forces at work in the universe. Newton's first law contradicted the popular belief that it was natural for moving objects to slow down and eventually stop moving. Instead, Newton stated that any change in the motion of an object was the result of a force. A ball or brick set in motion slows down and stops because of the force of friction. If a frictionless environment were available, a moving object could theoretically stay in motion forever. Newton's first law is reinforced whenever objects are sent into the almost frictionless environment of space. Newton's second law describes acceleration, or changes in speed. Newton found that acceleration is directly proportional to the amount of force applied and inversely proportional to mass. To paraphrase this law, if an object is pushed twice as hard, it will accelerate twice as much. If you double its mass and push it with the same force, it will accelerate by just half as much. This law is important to engineers today as they work to increase the efficiency of automobiles. One of the principal methods for increasing gas mileage is reducing the mass of the vehicle. Thus, the hulking behemoths of a few years ago have been replaced by the svelte sports sedans of today. Perhaps because of its brevity, Newton's third law is one of the most quoted. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. If you step off a boat that is not securely moored, the boat may move backward as much as you try to move forward. If the goal was to step on the dock, Newton's third law could leave you very wet.
An interesting story indeed, and an easy way to kind of understand the basics of Newton's 3 laws of motion. Well, first let's talk a little about Sir Isaac Newton. Is it true that the story of the apple falling on his head not exactly accurate?
Yes, it's true that there's no evidence to support the popular story that Newton discovered gravity when an apple fell on his head. However, it is certain that observing falling objects caused Newton to think about the forces at work in the universe. So maybe it was an apple or some other fruit, or a combination of many things falling, who knows? What matters is that he figured out why they were falling.
That's right. Well, physics has gone a long way since Newton, but his three laws still stand. What does that tell you about Newton?
It tells us that Sir Isaac Newton was a truly brilliant physicist and mathematician. His three laws of motion were groundbreaking and laid the foundation for modern physics. The fact that his laws still stand today, centuries after they were first formulated, is a testament to the depth of his understanding and his ability to articulate complex concepts in a way that has stood the test of time. Newton's contributions to science continue to be felt today, and he is rightly celebrated as one of the greatest minds in history.
All right, let's start digging in and talk about the keywords we have in this text. Let's start with the first keyword in this episode, apocryphal. apocryphal. How do we use it in the context of our story, and what does it mean?
Sure thing. The word apocryphal was used in the context of the story about Sir Isaac Newton and the apple, and it means that the story is of doubtful authenticity or unlikely to be true. In other words, the story may be a popular myth or legend that has been passed down over time, but there's no factual basis to support it. In the text we read, the author mentions that there's no evidence to support the story of Newton discovering gravity when an apple fell on his head, and suggests that it's likely an apocryphal tale.
Can we use apocryphal in other contexts with different meanings?
Yes, apocryphal can be used in other contexts with different meanings. Apart from its meaning of doubtful authenticity or unlikely to be true, apocryphal can also mean something that is of or belonging to the Apocrypha, which is a group of biblical writings that are not considered canonical by some religious traditions. In this context, apocryphal refers specifically to writings that are not considered part of the accepted canon of Scripture. Additionally, apocryphal can also be used to describe something that is secret or hidden, especially in a religious or mystical context.
Can you think of any other words related to apocryphal?
Sure. Some words related to apocryphal include legendary, mythical, fictitious, spurious, dubious, questionable, and unsubstantiated. These words all share the idea that something is not entirely true or reliable and may be based more on myth or legend than on verifiable facts.
Are there any common mistakes people make when they use apocryphal?
One common mistake people make when using the word apocryphal is to confuse it with the word obscure, which means something that is difficult to understand or unknown. While both words relate to things that are not well known or clear, they have distinct meanings. Apocryphal refers specifically to things that are of doubtful authenticity or unlikely to be true, while obscure refers to things that are unclear or difficult to understand due to a lack of information or obscurity. It's also important to note that apocryphal is not the same as heretical, which refers to beliefs or practices that are contrary to established religious or philosophical doctrine.
Excellent. Now let's move on to the next key word, behemoth. behemoth. How do we use it in the context of our story, and what does it mean?
The word behemoth was used in the context of the story to describe large and unwieldy vehicles that were common in the past. In general, behemoth refers to something that is large and powerful and is often used to describe animals or things that are of immense size or strength. In the context of the story, the author notes that engineers today work to increase the efficiency of automobiles and that one of the principal methods for increasing gas mileage is reducing the mass of the vehicle that has led to the replacement of the hulking behemoths of the past with more svelte and efficient vehicles.
Can we use behemoth in other contexts with different meanings?
Yes, behemoth can be used in other contexts with different meanings. Although the term is most commonly used to refer to large and powerful animals or things, it can also be used to describe people or organizations that are powerful, dominant, or influential. For example, a large corporation that dominates a particular industry might be referred to as a behemoth. Additionally, behemoth can be used to describe anything that is difficult to manage or control due to its size or complexity, such as a large-scale project or an unwieldy bureaucracy.
Can you think of any other words related to behemoth?
Sure, some words related to behemoth include giant, colossus, titan, monster, mammoth, leviathan, juggernaut, and whopper. These words all share the idea of something that is large and powerful, often to the point of being unwieldy or difficult to manage. Some of these words, like juggernaut, also carry connotations of being unstoppable or crushing in their power, while others, like whopper, suggest something that is simply very large or impressive.
Are there any common mistakes people make when they use behemoth?
One common mistake people make when using the word behemoth is to confuse it with the word mammoth, which also refers to something that is large and powerful. While both words can be used to describe large animals or things, they have different connotations. Behemoth carries connotations of being unwieldy or difficult to manage, while mammoth suggests something that is simply very large or imposing. Another mistake people sometimes make is use behemoth to describe something that is simply big, without considering the connotations of being difficult to manage or control.
Excellent. Now let's move on to the next key word, brevity. brevity. How do we use it in the context of our story, and what does it mean?
The word brevity was used in the context of the story to describe the third law of motion formulated by Sir Isaac Newton. In general, brevity refers to the quality of being brief or concise. In the context of the story, the author notes that Newton's third law is one of the most quoted because of its brevity. This means that the law is often cited and remembered because it is easy to remember and express succinctly. The law itself states that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, which can be expressed in a short and simple phrase.
All right. Can we use brevity in other contexts with different meanings?
Yes, brevity can be used in other contexts with different meanings. While the word typically refers to the quality of being brief or concise, it can also be used to describe something that is brief or short in duration. For example, a speech or presentation that is short and to the point might be described as having brevity, and a movie or book that is short in length might also be said to have brevity. Additionally, brevity can be used to describe something that is short or limited in scope or detail, such as a summary or a brief report. In this sense, brevity refers not only to the length of the content, but also to its level of detail and comprehensiveness.
Can you think of any other words related to brevity?
Sure, some words related to brevity include conciseness, terse, pithiness, succinctness, clarity, directness, and simplicity. These words all relate to the idea of being brief and to the point, often in the context of communication. Some of these words, like conciseness and succinctness, focus specifically on the quality of being brief or to the point, while others, like clarity and simplicity, emphasize the idea of communicating clearly and effectively, even in a limited amount of space or time.
Are there any common mistakes people make when they use brevity?
One common mistake people make when using the word brevity is to assume that it always refers to the length of something without considering its level of detail or comprehensiveness. While brevity does typically refer to the quality of being brief or concise, it can also refer to the level of detail and comprehensiveness in addition to the length of something. Another mistake people sometimes make is to assume that something that is brief or to the point is necessarily better than something that is more detailed or comprehensive. While brevity can be a desirable quality in communication, it is not always the most important factor, and sometimes more detailed or comprehensive explanations may be necessary to convey complex or nuanced ideas effectively.
Excellent. Now let's move on to the next keyword, dally. D-A-L-L-Y. How do we use it in the context of our story, and what does it mean?
The word dally was used in the context of the story to describe what Sir Isaac Newton did not do during his time at his mother's farm. In general, dally means to waste time or to engage in idle or frivolous activities. In the context of the story, the author notes that Newton did not waste his time during his respite from formal education, but instead used the opportunity to study and think. This means that Newton did not dally or engage in idle or frivolous activities, but instead applied himself to his work and intellectual pursuits.
Can we use dally in other contexts with different meanings?
Yes, dally can be used in other contexts with different meanings. While the word typically refers to wasting time or engaging in idle activities, it can also be used to describe playful or flirtatious behavior. For example, someone who is flirting with another person might be said to be dallying with them. Additionally, dally can be used to describe someone who is not taking a situation seriously or is being careless or irresponsible. In this sense, the word carries negative connotations and suggests that someone is not taking their responsibilities or obligations seriously.
Can you think of any other words related to dally?
Sure, some words related to dally include procrastinate, lollygag, loiter, waste time, fritter, idleness, inactivity, leisure, and frivolity. These words all relate to the idea of wasting time or engaging in unproductive activities, often to the detriment of one's responsibilities or obligations. Some of these words, like procrastinate and lollygag, emphasize the idea of delaying or putting off important tasks, while others, like frivolity and inactivity, suggest a lack of seriousness or purpose.
Are there any common mistakes people make when they use dally?
One common mistake people make when using the word dally is to assume that it always carries negative connotations. While dally does typically refer to wasting time or engaging in unproductive activities, it can also be used in a playful or flirtatious sense that does not necessarily carry negative connotations. Another mistake people sometimes make is to use dally to describe any kind of leisure activity without considering whether the activity is actually unproductive or wasteful. While leisure activities can be important for relaxation and well-being, they are not the same as dallying, which suggests a lack of purpose or direction.
Excellent. Now let's move on to the next key word, depreciate. D-E-P-R-E-C-I-A-T-E. How do we use it in the context of our story, and what does it mean?
The word depreciate was used in the context of the story to describe Sir Isaac Newton's attitude towards his own contributions to science. In general, depreciate means to undervalue or to express disapproval or criticism of something or someone. In the context of the story, the author notes that Newton was a humble person who always tried to depreciate his contributions to science, preferring instead to honor the scientists who had preceded him. This means that Newton did not seek to overvalue or take credit for his accomplishments, but instead expressed humility and gratitude towards those who had come before him.
Can we use depreciate in other contexts with different meanings?
Yes, depreciate can be used in other contexts with different meanings. While the word typically refers to undervaluing or expressing disapproval of something or someone, it can also be used to describe the decrease in value of an asset over time. For example, a car or a house might depreciate in value over time as it becomes older or less desirable. Additionally, depreciate can be used in a financial sense to describe the reduction in value of a currency or other financial instrument due to factors such as inflation or economic instability. In this sense, depreciate refers to the decline in purchasing power or value of the currency or financial instrument.
Can you think of any other words related to depreciate?
Sure. Some words related to depreciate include devalue, downgrade, discount, diminish, demean, denigrate, underrate, and undermine. These words all relate to the idea of reducing the value, worth, or importance of something or someone, either through criticism or through a decline in actual value. Some of these words, like devalue and downgrade, emphasize the idea of reducing the actual value or status of something, while others, like denigrate and undermine, suggest a deliberate effort to reduce the perceived value or worth of something or someone through criticism or other negative means.
Are there any common mistakes people make when they use depreciate?
One common mistake people make when using the word depreciate is to confuse it with the word deprecate, which has a similar sound but a different meaning. While depreciate means to undervalue or to decrease in value over time, deprecate, which is by the way spelled D-E-P-R-E-C-A-T-E, means to express disapproval or to criticize something or someone. Another mistake people sometimes make is to use depreciate to describe any kind of reduction in value without considering whether the reduction is a natural or expected process, such as the depreciation of a car or house over time. While depreciate can be used in this sense, it is important to distinguish between natural or expected depreciation and the more deliberate or negative process of devaluing or denigrating something or someone through criticism or other means.
Excellent. Now let's move on to the next key word, paraphrase. paraphrase. How do we use it in the context of our story, and what does it mean?
The word paraphrase was used to explain Newton's second law of motion in other words. In general, paraphrase means to restate something in different words, often for the purpose of clarification or simplification. In the context of the story, the author notes that Newton's second law describes acceleration or changes in speed, and that it can be paraphrased as follows. If an object is pushed twice as hard, it will accelerate twice as much. This means that the law can be restated or simplified for easier understanding while still conveying the same basic idea.
Can we use paraphrase in other contexts with different meanings?
No, paraphrase generally has only one meaning, which is to restate something in different words for the purpose of clarification or simplification. However, it can be used in different contexts, such as in academic writing, journalism, or legal contexts, where it is often necessary to restate complex or technical language in simpler terms that are more accessible to a wider audience. In addition, the term paraphrase can be used in language learning contexts where students are often asked to restate passages from a foreign language into their own words for practice and comprehension.
Can you think of any other words related to paraphrase?
Sure, some words related to paraphrase include rephrase, reword, restatement, translation, interpretation, clarification, simplification, explanation, and elucidation. These words all relate to the idea of expressing something in different words or explaining something more clearly and comprehensively. Some of these words like rephrase and reword emphasize the idea of changing the wording or language of something, while others like clarification and elucidation suggest a more in-depth or detailed explanation of a concept or idea.
Are there any common mistakes people make when they use paraphrase?
One common mistake people make when using the word paraphrase is to assume that it means simply restating something in different words without considering the purpose or context of the restatement. Paraphrasing is not just about changing the words, but about conveying the same meaning in a different form that is easier to understand or more appropriate for the intended audience. Another mistake people sometimes make is to paraphrase too closely or without attribution, which can result in unintentional plagiarism. When paraphrasing, it is important not only to change the wording, but also to attribute the original source and to ensure that the restatement is not so similar to the original that it could be mistaken for plagiarism.
Excellent. Now let's move on to the next keyword, reinforce. reinforce. How did we use it in the context of our story, and what does it mean?
Sure. The word reinforce was used in the context of the story to describe how Newton's first law of motion is reinforced by observing objects in space. In general, reinforce means to strengthen or support something, often through repetition or additional evidence. In the context of the story, the author notes that Newton's first law contradicted the popular belief that it was natural for moving objects to slow down and eventually stop moving. Instead, Newton stated that any change in the motion of an object was the result of a force. The author then goes on to explain that this law is reinforced whenever objects are sent into the almost frictionless environment of space. This means that the observation of objects in space supports or strengthens the idea that motion continues indefinitely unless acted upon by a force.
Can we use reinforce in other contexts with different meanings?
Yes, reinforce can be used in other contexts with different meanings. While the word typically refers to strengthening or supporting something, it can also be used to describe the act of adding more material to an existing structure to make it stronger or more durable. For example, a concrete wall might be reinforced with steel bars to make it more resistant to damage or collapse. Additionally, reinforce can be used in a psychological sense to describe the act of encouraging or rewarding certain behaviors or attitudes in order to strengthen them. For example, a parent might reinforce good behavior in a child by praising them or offering rewards, or a therapist might reinforce positive changes in a patient's behavior by providing encouragement or support. In this sense, reinforce refers to the act of strengthening or consolidating a desired behavior or attitude through positive feedback or reward.
Can you think of any other words related to reinforce?
Sure. Some words related to reinforce include strengthen, support, bolster, fortify, renew, revitalize, enhance, amplify, and augment. These words all relate to the idea of adding strength, support, or additional resources to something in order to make it more effective or durable. Some of these words, like strengthen and bolster, emphasize the idea of adding physical or structural support, while others, like renew and revitalize, suggest a process of renewing or revitalizing something that has become weak or depleted. Additionally, some of these words, like enhance and amplify, emphasize the idea of adding value or quality to something rather than simply reinforcing its existing strengths or resources.
Are there any common mistakes people make when they use reinforce?
One common mistake people make when using the word reinforce is to use it as a synonym for repeat or reiterate, without considering the purpose or context of the repetition. Reinforcement involves not just repetition, but also the addition of something that strengthens or supports the original idea or behavior. Another mistake people sometimes make is to assume that reinforcement always involves positive feedback or reward, when in fact it can also involve negative feedback or punishment. Reinforcement simply refers to the process of strengthening or supporting a desired behavior or attitude through the addition of positive or negative stimuli. It is important to use reinforce appropriately and to consider the intended purpose and context of the reinforcement in order to avoid confusion or misunderstandings.
Excellent. Now let's move on to the next key word, relatively. R-E-L-A-T-I-V-E-L-Y. How do we use it in the context of our story, and what does it mean?
Sure, the word relatively was used in the context of the story to describe how Newton's 3 laws of motion reduce nearly all the motion we observe to concepts that are relatively simple considering the complexities of physics. In general, relatively means to a certain extent or in comparison to something else, and is often used to qualify or limit the degree of something. In the context of the story, the author is pointing out that while physics as a field can be incredibly complex and challenging, Newton's 3 laws of motion provide a relatively simple framework for understanding a wide range of physical phenomena. The use of relatively suggests that the simplicity of Newton's laws is not absolute, but rather exists in comparison to the more complex aspects of physics that they help to explain.
Can we use relatively in other contexts with different meanings?
Yes, relatively can be used in other contexts with different meanings. While the word typically means to a certain extent or in comparison to something else, it can also be used to describe something that is dependent on or influenced by other factors. For example, someone might say that a business is relatively successful, meaning that its success is dependent on certain factors such as market conditions or consumer demand. Additionally, relatively can be used to describe something that is not absolute or definitive, but rather subject to interpretation or judgment. For example, someone might say that a piece of artwork is relatively good, meaning that its quality is subject to individual interpretation and judgment. In this sense, relatively emphasizes the subjectivity or relativity of the judgment rather than any objective standard of quality or excellence.
Can you think of any other words related to relatively?
Sure. Some words related to relatively include comparatively, proportionately, moderately, somewhat, to some extent, partially, conditionally, and in relation to. These words all relate to the idea of something being dependent on or influenced by other factors or being subject to comparison or interpretation. Some of these words, like comparatively or proportionately, emphasize the idea of comparing or measuring something in relation to other factors or criteria, while others, like somewhat and moderately, suggest a degree or extent of something that is less than absolute or definitive. Overall, these words suggest that the meaning or value of something is not fixed or objective, but rather depends on a variety of contextual factors and conditions.
Are there any common mistakes people make when they use relatively?
One common mistake people make when using the word relatively is to use it in a way that is unclear or imprecise, without providing a clear comparison or context for what is being described. For example, saying that something is relatively cheap without specifying what it is being compared to or what the expected price range might be can be confusing or ambiguous. Another mistake people sometimes make is to use relatively in a way that implies a degree of subjectivity or ambiguity that may not be appropriate for the context. For example, saying that something is relatively good or relatively successful without providing clear criteria or benchmarks for what constitutes goodness or success can make it difficult for others to understand or evaluate the statement. To use relatively effectively, it is important to provide clear comparisons or context for what is being described and to use the word in a way that is appropriate and relevant to the intended audience or purpose.
Excellent. Now let's move on to the next key word, respite. R-E-S-P-I-T-E. How do we use it in the context of our story and what does it mean?
Sure. The word respite was used in the context of the story to describe a temporary break or pause in activity, during which Newton was able to study and think. In general, respite means a period of relief or rest from something difficult or challenging, often as a temporary measure. In the context of the story, Newton was forced to leave Cambridge University temporarily due to the plague and took the opportunity to study and think at his mother's farm. The use of respite emphasizes that this period of time was a welcome break or interruption from his usual routine and allowed him to focus on his intellectual pursuits without distraction or interruption.
Can we use respite in other contexts with different meanings?
Yes, respite can be used in other contexts with different meanings. While the word typically means a temporary break or pause in activity, it can also be used to describe a more long-term relief or cessation of something difficult or challenging. For example, someone might say that a particular treatment provided a respite from chronic pain or illness, meaning that it provided a sustained period of relief or improvement in symptoms. Additionally, respite can be used in a more metaphorical sense to describe a period of emotional or psychological relief from stress or hardship. For example, someone might say that taking a vacation provided a much-needed respite from the stresses of work, or that spending time with loved ones provided a respite from feelings of loneliness or isolation. In this sense, respite suggests a broader concept of relief or rejuvenation, rather than simply a temporary break from a specific activity or challenge.
Can you think of any other words related to respite?
Sure, some words related to respite include break, pause, intermission, rest, relief, recess, hiatus, lull, and breather. These words all suggest a temporary break or interruption from a specific activity or situation, and can be used to describe a variety of contexts and situations. Some of these words like break and pause emphasize the idea of stopping or pausing an activity, while others like rest and relief suggest a period of relaxation or rejuvenation. Additionally, some of these words like hiatus and lull suggest a longer or more significant break or interruption, while others like breather suggest a more temporary or momentary relief from stress or difficulty. Overall, these words suggest a variety of ways in which people can take a break or find relief from challenging or stressful situations.
Are there any common mistakes people make when they use respite?
One common mistake people make when using the word respite is to use it in a way that is overly vague or imprecise, without providing clear context or comparison. For example, saying that someone needs a respite without specifying what they need a break from or what the expected duration of the break might be can be confusing or ambiguous. Another mistake people sometimes make is to use respite in a way that implies a more significant or long-term break than is actually intended or appropriate for the context. For example, saying that someone is taking a respite from work when they are actually just taking a short break can be misleading or inaccurate. To use respite effectively, it is important to provide clear context and comparison for what is being described, and to use the word in a way that is appropriate and relevant to the intended audience or purpose.
Excellent. Now let's move on to the last keyword, svelte. S-V-E-L-T-E. How do we use it in the context of our story, and what does it mean?
The word svelte was used in the context of the story to describe the trend towards smaller, more streamlined vehicles that has emerged in recent years. In general, svelte means slender, graceful, or elegant in appearance or form. In the context of the story, the word svelte was used to describe the design and appearance of modern sports sedans, which are typically smaller and more aerodynamic than the larger, heavier vehicles of the past. The use of svelte emphasizes the idea that these vehicles are designed to be sleek and stylish, as well as efficient and practical.
Can we use svelte in other contexts with different meanings?
Not really. The word svelte is typically used to describe a person or object that is slender or graceful in appearance or form. While the word may be used metaphorically to describe other things, it is generally not used to describe abstract concepts or intangible qualities. For example, one would not typically describe a business strategy or a political policy as svelte, as the word does not have a clear or appropriate meaning in these contexts. However, the word svelte can be used in a variety of other contexts to describe physical or aesthetic qualities such as fashion, design, or architecture.
Can you think of any other words related to svelte?
Sure, some words related to svelte include slender, graceful, elegant, lithe, streamlined, chic, stylish, sophisticated, trim, and well-proportioned. These words all suggest a sense of physical or aesthetic grace and elegance and can be used to describe a variety of people, objects, or concepts. Some of these words, like slender and trim, emphasize the idea of a streamlined or sleek appearance, while others, like graceful and elegant, suggest a more refined or sophisticated quality. Overall, these words suggest a variety of ways in which physical or aesthetic qualities can be described with a sense of grace and elegance.
Are there any common mistakes people make when they use svelte?
One common mistake people make when using the word svelte is to use it to describe something that is not actually slender or graceful in appearance or form. For example, if someone were to describe a large, bulky object as svelte, this would be inaccurate and misleading, as the word specifically refers to something that is slender and graceful in appearance. Additionally, some people may use the word svelte in a way that is overly vague or imprecise without providing clear context or comparison. To use svelte effectively, it is important to understand the precise meaning of the word and to use it in a way that is appropriate and relevant to the context in which it is being used. Providing clear examples or comparisons can help to ensure that the meaning of the word is understood correctly.
Perfect. Now, can you please sum up the 10 key words that we talked about and remind us of their meaning?
Sure. Here's a quick summary of the 10 key words we talked about and their meanings. Let me start with apocryphal. This means of doubtful authenticity, although widely circulated as being true. Example, the story of Newton discovering gravity by an apple falling on his head is often considered apocryphal. The next word is behemoth, which means something that is huge or enormous, often used to describe large objects or organizations. Example, the Behemoth Corporation dominated the market for years until new competitors emerged. Next, we have brevity, which is the quality of being brief or concise, often used to describe written or spoken communication that is short and to the point. Example, the writer's talent for brevity allowed her to convey complex ideas in just a few words. And next we have dally, which means to waste time or procrastinate, often used to describe someone who is not taking a task or responsibility seriously. For example, rather than dallying, Newton used his time away from Cambridge to study and think. And next we have depreciate, which means to decrease in value over time, often used to describe the decline in worth of an asset or investment. For example, the value of the car depreciated rapidly over the first few years of ownership. And then we talked about paraphrase, which means to restate a passage or text in one's own words, often used to clarify or simplify complex ideas. For example, the student was asked to paraphrase the poem in order to demonstrate their understanding of its themes. And next we have reinforce, which means to strengthen or support, often used to describe the process of adding strength or stability to a structure or idea. For example, Newton's first law is reinforced by the observation that objects in space can continue moving indefinitely. And next we have relatively, which means to a certain extent or in comparison to something else, often used to qualify or clarify a statement. For example, while Newton's laws may seem complex at first, they are relatively simple when compared to the full complexity of physics. And next we have respite, which means a temporary break or pause in activity often used to describe a period of relief from stress or difficulty. For example, taking a brief respite can help to alleviate feelings of burnout or fatigue. And finally, we have svelte, which means slender or graceful in appearance or form, often used to describe objects or people with a sleek, streamlined appearance. For example, the modern sports sedans are designed to be both svelte and efficient, with a focus on aerodynamics and style.
All right then, I guess that's all we need to discuss for this episode. We have discussed these 10 keywords in great depth, and I hope everyone finds the information we shared in this episode useful.
I hope so too, Ben. And to our listeners everywhere, thanks for joining us for this episode where we delved into 10 interesting and useful keywords from a text about Sir Isaac Newton's laws of motion. We hope that you learned something new and interesting about these words and that you'll be able to use them in your everyday conversations and writing. Don't forget to follow our podcast on your favorite platform, share it with others, and leave us a rating and review to help us reach more listeners. We look forward to exploring more fascinating topics with you in the future. This is your host, Danny. I will see you next time.